There is a quiet assumption that tends to sit in the background of many thoughts without ever being spoken out loud. It is the idea that a life can somehow be used up incorrectly, as if existence were a kind of limited resource handed to us at birth, with an unspoken instruction manual, and that somewhere along the way we might fail to follow it properly. And if we fail, then at the end, we look back and discover that what we had was squandered. Not violently destroyed, not dramatically lost, but quietly wasted. This assumption rarely arrives with noise. It doesn't announce itself as a belief. It feels more like a mood, a faint pressure behind the eyes when time passes too quickly, a subtle tightening in the chest when comparing oneself to an image of what life was supposed to look like by now. It often disguises itself as seriousness, as responsibility, as realism. It says, "This matters, time is running, you must account for yourself." And yet, it is interesting how this concern appears almost exclusively in the human mind. A tree does not pause in winter and worry that it failed to bloom enough in spring. A river does not look back at its own bends and wonder whether it flowed efficiently. A cloud does not drift across the sky with a sense of regret that it did not rain somewhere more important. These things unfold, change, dissolve, and reappear without commentary. They do not carry an internal auditor measuring usefulness against expectation. But the human being, for reasons that are not entirely obvious, has learned to stand slightly outside of their own experience and watch it as if from a distance. And from that distance, life can start to look like a project, a narrative, a line that should be moving in a particular direction. And once life is seen this way, the idea of waste becomes possible. You can only waste something if it is supposed to be used for a purpose. This is where the illusion quietly enters. Because the moment you say, "This life should have been something else," you are already assuming that there was a fixed destination it was meant to arrive at. Not just preferences, not just desires, but an implied correct outcome. A version of events that would have justified the time spent breathing, aging, and waking up each morning. And the strange thing is that this imagined destination is rarely clear. It shifts constantly. At one moment it looks like success, at another like happiness, at another like impact, recognition, stability, or meaning. Sometimes it is defined by money, sometimes by relationships, sometimes by internal peace. Often it borrows its shape from other people's lives, or from cultural images absorbed without noticing. It is assembled quietly, piece by piece, until one day it feels obvious, even though no one remembers agreeing to it. Once this imagined destination exists, time itself begins to feel heavy. Minutes are no longer just minutes. Years are no longer just years. They become units that must justify themselves. And the mind begins to ask questions that sound practical, but carry an undercurrent of anxiety. Am I on track? Am I behind? Did I miss something essential? This is where the metaphor of life as a path becomes particularly seductive. If there is a path, then there is progress. If there is progress, then there are wrong turns. And if there are wrong turns, then there is the haunting possibility that one might walk for decades only to discover that they have been heading in the wrong direction the entire time. But notice how this metaphor quietly turns experience into a judgment. Because walking itself is no longer enough. Breathing, sensing, thinking, feeling, loving, fearing, all of this becomes secondary to where it is supposedly leading. The present moment is tolerated only as a stepping stone toward a future evaluation. And when the present is treated this way, it begins to feel thin, almost unreal, like a waiting room rather than a place where life is actually happening. At this point, identity begins to harden. One is no longer simply someone who lives, but someone who is becoming something or failing to. The sense of self tightens around timelines, roles, achievements, and missed opportunities. Memory becomes selective, highlighting moments that appear to confirm either success or failure. The future becomes a projection screen for imagined redemption or imagined regret. And between the two, the current moment struggles to justify its existence. This is often when the idea of a wasted life starts to feel emotionally convincing, not because something catastrophic has happened, but because nothing dramatic enough seems to have happened. Life appears ordinary, repetitive, unremarkable, and measured against the internal image of what it was supposed to be. Ordinariness begins to feel like loss, as if simply being here doing this was never the point. Yet this entire tension rests on a subtle confusion. It assumes that life is something you have, rather than something that is happening. When life is treated as a possession, it can be evaluated, compared, optimized, or squandered. But when life is seen as an event, a continuous, unrepeatable, unfolding, the language of waste starts to sound strange. You would not say that a thunderstorm wasted itself because it did not last longer. You would not say that a sunset failed because it was followed by night. These things do not exist to reach a verdict. They exist to occur. And the unsettling implication is that perhaps the same is true here. Not that meaning disappears, but that meaning may not be something waiting at the end of a properly executed plan. It may be inseparable from the experience itself, including its confusion, its detours, its pauses, and its quiet stretches where nothing seems to be happening at all. This realization does not arrive as comfort, it arrives as disorientation. Because if life is not a task to be completed, then the internal pressure to justify every year, every choice, every version of oneself begins to loosen, and with it, the familiar sense of control. The mind resists this loosening. It prefers anxiety over ambiguity. It prefers the pain of feeling behind to the uncertainty of not knowing what ahead even means. So the illusion persists, not because it is true, but because it feels stabilizing. And this is where the tension deepens, not resolves. The thought of a wasted life is not really about the past. It is about the fear that the present is insufficient and that the future will confirm it. It is a way the mind keeps watch over itself, making sure nothing slips through unnoticed. And yet, in doing so, it often misses the very thing it claims to protect. The fact that life is already in motion, already happening, already whole in ways that cannot be audited from the outside. Here, the reflection pauses not because something has been concluded, but because something has been disturbed. A quiet certainty has been gently unsettled, and the mind is left hovering between the old framework and something that does not yet have clear language. And from this hovering, the next movement begins. When the familiar framework begins to loosen, the mind often reacts by trying to rebuild it more carefully. It says perhaps the standards were wrong, but surely there must still be some standard. And so the idea of a wasted life quietly reshapes itself. It becomes more subtle, more internal, no longer about obvious success or visible milestones, but about something harder to define: authenticity, fulfillment, alignment, living true to oneself. This sounds gentler, but the structure underneath remains the same. There is still an image of how life ought to have unfolded. It may now be softer around the edges, but it is no less demanding. One is expected not just to live, but to live correctly from the inside, to have chosen the right motivations, the right priorities, the right attitude toward experience. And if this inner alignment feels missing, the same old whisper returns: something has gone wrong. What is rarely noticed is how much effort it takes to maintain this constant self-surveillance. There is an invisible observer that seems to sit just behind experience, evaluating it as it happens. While a conversation unfolds, part of the mind asks whether it is meaningful enough. While a quiet afternoon passes, another part wonders whether this stillness is nourishing or merely avoidance. Even rest becomes something to justify. Even joy can feel suspicious, as though it should be leading somewhere. This inner observer feels personal, but it is not exactly you. It behaves more like an internalized viewpoint, assembled from expectations absorbed over time: cultural, familial, social, and psychological. It learns how a life is supposed to look by watching other lives, by hearing stories framed as lessons, by absorbing narratives about purpose and potential. Eventually, it speaks with your own voice. And once that voice is in place, experience is rarely allowed to be just experience. There is a quiet tension that builds here, a subtle strain between what is happening and what should be happening. The present moment becomes slightly uncomfortable, not because of anything it contains, but because of what it fails to deliver. It is never quite enough on its own. It must point beyond itself to some larger coherence, some eventual justification that will make sense of everything in retrospect. This is where time becomes especially distorted. The past turns into evidence, the future turns into a courtroom, and the present becomes a fragile bridge between the two, constantly evaluated for structural integrity. Moments are no longer lived, they are archived, anticipated, or rehearsed. And the longer this goes on, the more the sense of being inside life gives way to the feeling of watching it from a distance. Ironically, this distance is often mistaken for wisdom. It feels mature to be reflective, responsible to evaluate one's choices, serious to consider how life adds up. And none of these are inherently wrong. But when reflection hardens into constant self-measurement, something subtle is lost. The immediacy of experience begins to fade, replaced by a conceptual version of oneself moving through a conceptual version of life. At this point, identity becomes less like a fluid sense of presence and more like a fixed shape that must be defended. One is a certain kind of person, someone who values growth, someone who does not want to waste time, someone who is trying to live meaningfully. These identities sound admirable, but they also create boundaries. They decide in advance which experiences count and which do not. They label certain periods as productive and others as empty. And once labeled, these judgments quietly feed the anxiety they were meant to prevent. Because if there is a correct way to live, then deviation becomes failure. And failure, in this context, does not always look dramatic. It often looks like drifting, like uncertainty, like not knowing what comes next, like staying too long in one place or leaving too early, like choosing something ordinary when something extraordinary was imagined. And when life takes these quieter shapes, the idea of waste creeps in, not as a conclusion, but as a background hum. Yet there is something deeply peculiar about judging life this way, because the judgment always happens from inside the experience, never from outside it. The mind imagines a vantage point where the entire arc of life can be assessed, but that vantage point never actually exists. Even the imagined future self looking back is still a present thought, happening now. There is no final balcony from which existence can be evaluated without participation. And still, the mind keeps trying. It keeps trying because the alternative feels unsettling. If life is not something to be optimized or justified, then what anchors identity? What organizes time? What gives coherence to memory? The idea of waste, uncomfortable as it is, provides structure. It tells a story. It gives the feeling that there is something at stake, something to get right. But this sense of stakes comes at a cost. The cost is a constant low-level anxiety, a feeling of being slightly behind one's own life, of needing to catch up to a version of oneself that exists only as an idea. And this anxiety does not resolve with achievement, because each achievement simply raises the question again at a subtler level. Was it enough? Was it aligned? Was it the right use of time? So the cycle continues, not because it brings clarity, but because it feels necessary. And yet, beneath this cycle, something quieter waits to be noticed. There are moments brief, often unremarkable when the evaluation drops away, when attention is fully absorbed in what is happening, without commentary. A sound, a movement, a sensation, a simple task done without urgency. In these moments, the question of waste does not arise, not because it has been answered, but because it makes no sense there. It belongs to a different mode of perception altogether. This suggests something important, though not yet fully formed. Perhaps the idea of a wasted life does not arise from life itself, but from a particular way of watching life. A way that stands slightly apart, measuring movement instead of participating in it. And if that is the case, then the feeling of waste is less a verdict about how things have gone, and more a signal that perception has become strained overly tight, overly serious, overly invested in coherence. This does not dissolve the concern. It reframes it. The tension remains, but its location begins to shift. It is no longer simply about what has been done or not done. It begins to look more like a friction between living and narrating, between experience as it unfolds and the story the mind insists on telling about it. And it is within this friction that the next turn quietly waits. When attention turns toward this friction, something subtle becomes visible. The strain does not come from events themselves, but from the effort to hold them inside a story that must make sense. The mind wants continuity, direction, explanation. It wants life to read like a sentence that moves cleanly from beginning to end. And when experience refuses to cooperate, when it feels circular, repetitive, or unresolved, the mind interprets this as malfunction. This is where the idea of a wasted life gains its emotional weight. Because waste implies not just loss, but misuse. It suggests that something living and fluid has been treated incorrectly, handled poorly, directed the wrong way. And this implication lands squarely on identity. It is not merely that time passed. It is that I passed through it incorrectly. I failed to shape myself into the right form. I failed to turn experience into the proper outcome. But notice how this assumes that identity itself is something solid enough to be shaped. In direct experience, the sense of self is far less stable than the stories told about it. It shifts with mood, context, memory, and attention. One moment it feels confident and coherent, the next uncertain and diffuse. It expands in moments of engagement and contracts in moments of fear. And yet, the narrative self, the one that worries about waste, pretends to be consistent. It imagines a single thread running through all of this, a character who could have made better choices if only they had known. This imagined continuity is comforting, but it is also deceptive, because it turns hindsight into a weapon. From the present, the past appears navigable. Alternatives seem obvious. Missed paths glow with imagined clarity. And so the mind looks backward and says, that was the moment. That was where things went wrong. That was where life began to slip away from what it was meant to be. But this clarity is an illusion created by time itself. At the moment, those choices were made. They did not appear as mistakes. They appeared as the only options available from within a particular state of understanding, emotion, and circumstance. The past self did not stand outside life with a map. It stood exactly where it could stand inside uncertainty, inside limitation, inside incomplete information. To judge that self from here is to forget the conditions under which it existed. And yet, the mind keeps doing this, because it believes that judgment protects the future. If I can identify where I went wrong, perhaps I can avoid wasting what remains. If I can learn the lesson, perhaps the rest of life can be redeemed. This is the quiet bargain behind regret. Endure the pain of self-criticism now in exchange for imagined control later. But control is precisely what is being chased and never caught. Because life does not repeat itself in ways that allow for clean correction. Each moment arrives with new variables, new constraints, new possibilities. The lesson extracted from one context rarely fits the next without distortion. And so the sense of being behind persists, even as understanding grows. One becomes wiser, but also more aware of complexity, and complexity resists simple redemption narratives. This is often when people begin to feel that time itself is an adversary. Years start to feel heavy, as though they are watching from the sidelines, waiting to be judged. Age becomes a scorecard rather than a condition. And the present moment, once again, becomes something to manage rather than inhabit. The fear is not simply of death, but of arriving at the end with an unfinished explanation. Yet here, something almost paradoxical appears. The very capacity to worry about a wasted life depends on being alive now. It depends on awareness, memory, imagination, and reflection, all present activities. The mind uses current vitality to construct a narrative in which vitality was somehow absent or misused. It stands on living ground to declare that life has been insufficient. This does not mean the feeling is wrong. It means it is misplaced. The tension belongs to the narrative layer, not to experience itself. And when this is seen, even dimly, the grip of the idea begins to loosen. Not because the story disappears, but because it is recognized as a story, a way of organizing perception, not a verdict delivered by reality. This recognition can feel unsettling. Without the story of waste, the familiar drama of before and after begins to blur. The sharp edges of success and failure soften. The timeline loses some of its authority. And in that softening, a strange question emerges, not loudly, but quietly. What if nothing has gone wrong? Not as a belief, not as reassurance, but as a genuine uncertainty. What if the detours were not deviations from life, but expressions of it? What if periods labeled as stagnant were not empty, but simply resistant to narration? What if the urge to account for oneself is not a sign of responsibility, but a misunderstanding of what life is actually doing? These questions do not resolve anything. They open space. And in that space, the idea of waste begins to look less like a truth about time and more like a symptom of taking the story too seriously, of confusing the map for the movement, of mistaking the commentary for the event. The tension does not vanish here. It changes texture. It becomes less accusatory, less urgent. It no longer insists on an immediate answer. It lingers as a kind of openness, a loosening of the internal grip. And in that loosening, something else becomes possible, not a conclusion, but a different relationship to the unfolding of experience. This is not yet the end of the reflection. It is the point where the weight of the question shifts, and the mind, having exhausted one way of looking, begins to sense another quieter, less dramatic, and harder to turn into a story. There is a quiet relief that comes when the story loosens its grip, not the relief of having found the right answer, but the relief of no longer needing one. The mind, so used to keeping score, does not disappear. It simply grows quieter. And in that quiet, something ordinary returns to the foreground. The simple fact of being here. Breathing happens without improvement. Sensation arises without justification. Thoughts appear, linger, dissolve. None of this is moving toward a verdict. None of it is waiting to be redeemed by a future interpretation. It is simply occurring in the same way weather occurs, or sound, or movement. From here, the idea of a wasted life begins to feel strangely abstract, not false in the sense of being stupid or naive, but unreal in the way a bad dream feels unreal after waking. Compelling while it lasts, emotionally convincing, yet impossible to locate once attention settles back into direct experience. Where exactly would waste be found? In which moment? In which breath? In which thought? The mind searches, but it can only find images, memories, comparisons, never waste itself. Because waste belongs to systems of use. It belongs to factories, schedules, plans, and outcomes. It belongs to things designed for specific ends. And life, when encountered directly, resists being placed cleanly inside that framework. It does not move in straight lines. It does not accumulate meaning the way a resume accumulates credentials. It does not pause to check whether it is living up to its potential. Potential is always an idea added afterward. This does not strip life of depth or significance. If anything, it returns depth to places it had quietly abandoned. The ordinary afternoon, the unfinished conversation, the years that did not produce a clear narrative. These begin to feel less like failures and more like what life looks like when it is not being edited. And in this unedited state, something subtle becomes apparent. Life does not unfold for the story you tell about it. The story unfolds within life, borrowing its energy, its attention, its sense of time. When the story grows heavy, life does not become wasted, it becomes obscured, covered over by interpretation, drowned out by commentary. The feeling of having wasted one's life is often not the recognition of an error, but the exhaustion of carrying the story too tightly for too long. This exhaustion can feel frightening. Without the story, there is less certainty about who one is and where one is going. The familiar pressure to account for oneself weakens, and in its place, there is a kind of openness that does not easily translate into goals or conclusions. But this openness is not emptiness. It is the same openness that allowed every moment up to now to happen at all. The same openness in which confusion appeared, and clarity appeared, and boredom appeared, and joy appeared, none of them permanent, none of them final. From this perspective, life does not look like a resource that can be squandered. It looks more like a field in which experiences arise and pass, leaving no residue that needs to be justified. Even regret, when it appears, is simply another experience moving through this field. It does not stand outside life passing judgment on it. It is part of the same unfolding. And when this is seen, regret loses some of its authority. It becomes a sensation, a thought, a memory, not a final assessment. There is no moment where life stops and asks whether it was worth it. That question belongs to the mind, and the mind asks it from inside the very thing it is questioning, which is why the answer never satisfies. The question assumes a distance that does not exist. It tries to evaluate movement from a place that is still moving. And perhaps this is the quiet shift, not toward optimism, not toward reassurance, but toward a gentler relationship with the fact that life does not resolve itself into a single meaning. It does not arrive at a summary statement. It continues, moment by moment, whether or not the story feels complete. From here, the fear of a wasted life does not need to be argued against. It does not need to be disproven or replaced. It can simply be seen as a thought, a particular way the mind reacts when it forgets that it is already participating in what it is trying to evaluate. And when that is remembered, even briefly, the urgency softens. Life does not suddenly become clear, but it becomes closer, less like a problem to be solved, and more like something already happening, uneven, unfinished, alive. And in that closeness, the idea of waste quietly loses its footing, not because it was defeated, but because it no longer knows where to stand.